earlier than normal and was kind enough to work with a mess up that I made. Kendall from D1 Baseball, D1Baseball.com, joins us on the Farm Bureau guest line. Kendall, 2 weeks left. 2 weeks left in the regular season. Let's start at the bottom, and then we'll work our way up from there. 3 teams playing for the last spot in the SEC tournament. Missouri at 7-17, Ole Miss and Mississippi State both at 6-18. Both Missouri and Mississippi State have tiebreakers over Ole Miss. Of those 3 teams, who ends up with the final spot in Hoover?
I will go with either Missouri or Ole Miss. I'll probably lean Missouri, but I mean, the team I have the least amount of confidence in, just because I look at the remaining schedule for me, is Mississippi State. I just think when you look at LSU, obviously that doesn't look very promising. And then they have A&M at home the final weekend. I mean, obviously A&M's one of those teams you have no idea what to expect on a given weekend. But, the last time they went on the road, other than the Arkansas series, they won a series for Kentucky. I actually thought they played really well over the weekend against Florida. So you're kind of catching A&M at a bad time. I would think they would win the Alabama series at home, so you're catching A&M at a bad time. So I would say of those 3 teams, like Mississippi State is probably the team I have the least amount of confidence in, mainly just because of the schedule. I think all 3 of those teams aren't very good, but I just think, look at that remaining schedule. I'm like, ooh, it looks rough.
There's a little bit of crossover in terms of the 3 of them with opponents over the final 3 weeks. Missouri's got Georgia at home, and then they go to Auburn to close it out. Ole Miss with Auburn, and then Alabama, Mississippi State, obviously with LSU and Texas A&M. Really difficult assignment, so we'll see how that plays out. I guess it was a week ago today when we first got the word that there was something going on with Alabama baseball, and then a couple of days later in the week, we get the decision that Brad Bohannon is out. I don't know that there's anything necessarily new in the story. Here's what I'm curious about. Alabama has, not for a good reason, but they have an opportunity to reset the direction of their program. And it's a program that's been very average since Jim Wells. Is this the point where Greg Byrne and Alabama finally say, let's get serious about baseball. We're going to pay real money. And that's not to knock what they were paying. I know it's a big salary for the majority of the world, but in comparison to the rest of the SEC, not so much. Is this the point where Alabama says we're going to get serious?
I think it needs to be. I mean, if you look at it from Alabama's perspective, if they're not going to do it this go around, they're probably never going to do it. Because when you look at their situation, Brad Bohannon, he's being investigated for something pretty serious. They're probably getting out of a buyout with Bohannon. So they're not going to have to pay a buyout, more than likely, unless he has an outrageously good lawyer. And that puts you in a situation where you might have a little bit more cash to spend, as opposed to, being in a situation where, you're having to pay a guy, $400,000 or $500,000 to buy his contract out. So I think when you look at Alabama, I do think Greg Byrne's going to spend money. Everything I've heard is that they're ready to actually spend some money on baseball in terms of making a premier coaching hire. The question will be like who can they attract? Can they finally get somebody like Cliff Godwin to leave East Carolina to go back to the SEC? I don't think that's the job for him. I think there's a better one out there for him in the SEC. But can they lure somebody like him? Is Justin Herrick Campbell a guy that they take a look at? Do they go see Dan McDonald? Louisville's had some really bad luck this year with some injuries over the last few weeks. They may not make the NCAA tournament. Does Alabama look at Dan and go, hey, the word on the street is that you'd like to be in the SEC, which is true. Like he's kind of always aspired for an SEC job. And is this the time that you decide to spend money and go, hey, why don't you come to the SEC? Why don't you become kind of the legend in the Alabama baseball program? Why don't you be our Saban in baseball? So I think they actually had some really intriguing candidate options. Again, if they're willing to spend money.
So why do you think Dan McDonald turned Mississippi State down a couple of years ago then? You think it was because he didn't want to coach in the same state with his friend Mike Bianco? There's got to be more to it than that.
Yeah, I mean, I think he was in a different spot. I mean, from talking to Dan in the last couple of years, he has not been ultra pleased with the ACC. He's been very vocal, actually been public about some of the things he's been annoyed with the ACC, particularly the league kind of fighting for the teams in that conference and whatnot. So I think the goalposts have moved for him a little bit when it comes to the ACC. The question here, the question then becomes to me, if if I'm, Mississippi State or someone else or Georgia, and I hear that Dan McDonnell has serious interest in Alabama, do I go, do I expedite changes to potentially bring him in? With that said, he's not going to Mississippi State if they get rid of Chris Lemonis. Like, that's just not going to happen. So the only other option for him would be Georgia, other than Alabama in the SEC.
Yeah, and I've always thought that that's a Georgia job that should be better than it has been. It should have more consistent success than it has had. So we'll see. You bring Mississippi State up. They obviously made a change of pitching coach with Scott Foxhall last week. We couldn't decide, and we've debated it a lot, whether or not that was okay. You're going to make that change, and then Chris Lemonis has got another year to kind of get things moving in the right direction. But if they lose 13 straight, and that would be getting swept this weekend and next weekend to close it out, 13 straight to close out the league, do you get any sense whatsoever what Zach Selman might be thinking? Because we have no sample size for how Zach Selman is going to handle a situation like this.
Well, what we know about Zach Selman is that he has yet to make a big splash. And that's not his fault. I'm just saying, he hasn't been in a position in Mississippi State just yet to make a massive splash. And every new AD known to man wants to make a big splash. And this could be his opportunity to do that. With that said, I have not seen a college baseball coaching change, occur 3 weeks after they just fired their pitching coach. Like, typically it's one of those things where, kind of read the tea leaves. It's like, hey, it's either you or this guy. This will be your one shot. This will be your one mulligan. They get rid of Scott Foxhall, and typically you kind of move on and go, okay, you have one more year. Let's go find a new pitching coach. Let's get this thing turned around. The problem you run into is they got rid of Scott Foxhall, and granted, nothing's ever an overnight fix. They get rid of Scott Foxhall. The pitching staff still stinks over the weekend, and like you said, they have a really tough remaining schedule. So it's kind of one of those things like, okay, we got rid of the guy we think might be the problem, and we just continue to get obliterated. So at that point, I could see Zach Selman looking at it and go, you know what? Maybe I should just pull the plug on this thing. Like, yeah, you know what? 3 weeks ago, I thought, let's just get rid of our pitching coach. But you know what? If we think we can go out and get one of these big names and we can change the trajectory of this program immediately, let's go do it. Because here's the thing. In the transfer portal era, if Mississippi State has robust NIL sitting there and they have a bunch of alums that are willing to say, hey, man, if you make a – and again, I hate to even talk about this because I love Chris Lemonis, but, if you have, all these boosters going, hey, man, we'll put a bunch of money in this deal, NIL-wise, if you make a move. Well, today's portal, A&M has shown it. South Carolina showed it this year. If you get a coach in there who has a bunch of money in the transfer portal, like Mississippi State, the talent level is not bad. They could turn that thing around in a year. The question will be, A, do they think Chris Lemonis can go out and hire a big-time pitching coach? B, if he can't, who can they bring in that's willing to take that job? And I think they would obviously have a lot of really good candidates.
Quick thought, Kentucky, were they the most surprising team last weekend with the weekend that they had against South Carolina? And have they locked up a host site? I mean, I know they're 14-10 and they can't go in the tank for the final 6 games. We've talked about how difficult their schedule is down the stretch. What are they going to do still at this point?
Yeah, it's kind of funny. I kind of used this phrase yesterday on a radio show, but Kentucky lost 4 straight series, and it's like sweeping South Carolina kind of washed away their sins, so to speak. Now that they've swept South Carolina, nobody cares that they've lost 4 straight series. So it's funny how quick your situation can change. And really, when you look at Kentucky now, they're 14-10 in the league. They don't have an easy schedule to finish up with, but if they can go 3-3 in those final 2 series, they'll have a top 5 RPI. They'll have great metrics across the board. If they can go 3-3 the next 2 weekends, which is a tall task, with Tennessee and Florida on the menu, they're a slam dunk top 8. Right now they're a host, but that would make them a slam dunk top 8 if they go 3-3 in these final 2 weekends. And again, this is a team that I thought would lose 7 straight series, and now we're going, hey, they just need to go 3-3 the rest of the way to be a top 8.
15 seconds. Do you think Tennessee plays themselves into a host, or are they going to be a nasty number 2 seed?
I think they're going to be a nasty number 2 seed. I think they're going to fall just short. And by the way, they're 2-11 on the road. There's not a committee in the world that's going to look at that record on the road and go, yeah, let's make them a host.
Yeah. Kim, about the Southern Mississippi Golden Eagles. I intended to do that, and we ran out of time because I got long-winded on questions. So, Kendall, 10 straight wins for the Golden Eagles.
Yeah.
RPI at 23, 24, somewhere in there. Manageable final 6 games against ULM and Louisiana. Sitting at 32 wins right now. We've talked about them the last couple of weeks as possibly a 2 seed if they have to go to Baton Rouge. Can they host? What have they got to do to host?
Well, I'm glad we get to talk about the best team in Mississippi.
Well, yeah.
I think you look at Southern Miss. I really like the resume at this point. They're right there for me with teams like Dallas Baptist and whatnot, right there in the mix. Who, by the way, they have a series win over Dallas Baptist, so they're ahead of those guys in the pecking order. But when you look at their winning streak, you look at the fact they're tied atop the Sun Belt with Coastal Carolina. Coastal Carolina right now would be a top 16 based on that head-to-head win over Southern Miss. So, in essence, they're not quite a top 16, but they are right there. I mean, they basically, in my opinion, control their own destiny. I think teams like Tennessee that are in the mix, Oregon State, Texas, teams like that, they have a lot to do. I think Southern Miss doesn't really have a lot to do. I think if they win the final 2 weekends and play really well in their conference tournament, I think they're a really good shot to be a regional host.
So we were playing around with that yesterday, and the truth of the matter is there's not a formula where it's like, if you do this, then this happens, because it doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? You can't control what happens all over the rest of the country. It feels like they can't afford to slip up against ULM, like they've got to sweep.
Yeah.
If they were to sweep ULM this weekend and then take 2 of 3 from the Raging Cajuns, and then let's just say they get to Saturday or Sunday in the Sun Belt tournament. So that puts them right at 40 wins. Is that the magic threshold for Southern Miss?
Yeah, I mean, that would put them in really good shape. But I'm glad you mentioned it because it isn't in a vacuum. And, you can look at the SEC, for instance, and there are 2 teams in Auburn and A&M that if they won their final 2 series and made a big run in Hoover, both of those teams could get in the mix for a host site. So as of right now, if they did what you just said, I think they would be in outstanding shape to host the top 16. But again, things can change. Oregon State could go up to 20 or 21. East Carolina could just go bonkers in the American tournament and be at 16 or 15 in the RPI, and all of a sudden they're hosting. I mean, look at Kentucky last week. They weren't even a top 16. Suddenly, they're right on the bubble for being a top 8. So things can change that quick, but as of right now, I think USM looks to be in pretty good shape. I'm a believer in that team right now.
I feel like I'm doing a bait and switch on you, so forgive me for asking you one more question. But since I've got you,
sure.
Is Stanford the only host on the West Coast?
Unless
Oregon State makes a run like you were talking about?
Yeah, as of right now, I mean, Oregon was in a good spot, but Oregon goes on the road and loses a series to USC. Their Friday guy's injured right now. I don't know what his status is going to be this weekend. Oregon State, we talk about how the RPI can change so quickly. Oregon State was in pole position last week, and they lost 1 game of a 3-game series at home to Utah, and they dropped to 32. So they're out right now. So the magic number really, for those of you kind of keeping track at home, the magic number really is like 24 or better in the RPI. If you're 24 or better in the RPI, you've got a shot to host. If you're behind that number, you've got an uphill battle to get a host, because as of right now, no one with an RPI below 24 has ever hosted in the top 16 seed era, which, by the way, is only a few years old.
We know the committee likes to make this as national as they can. Is there a scenario where we get 2 regionals in the Northeast where both Boston College and UConn end up hosting?
You could. I mean, right now, I feel pretty good about one of those teams hosting. I don't feel great about both of them hosting. I think BC, for instance, they're just 1 game over 500 in the ACC. I know they have a great RPI, but I think at the end of the day, when the dust settles, I think one of those 2 teams hosts, and it'll be interesting. We were just talking about Tennessee in the last segment. Imagine if Tennessee went to Boston College or UConn. Would anybody pick the host school in that situation?
No, probably not.
Probably not.
Hey, last one. Campbell? Can Campbell actually host?
Yeah, I mean, for me, Southern Miss is well ahead of them. But, I mean, they're up to 20 in the RPI. But I just don't think – I mean, when you look at their overall resume, there's not a lot of meat on the bone. They didn't do a lot in non-conference. I do think they're a really good team. I think they're going to rank well in the eye test with the committee. But for me, they're behind those other teams. I just, when you're taking a series from UNC Asheville and schools like that in the each weekend, like that's just way different than what teams do in the SEC, or frankly light years away from what a team's doing in the Sun Belt.